Amen. First, giving honor to God, the God who orders all of our steps. And I'm grateful that my steps have been so ordered that I have the great pleasure of being here back in, I'll say I have a few homes, but Iliff is the home that I didn't know that I needed at one point in my life, but I'm grateful to have had, and I'm grateful to be back here. Thank you to Dr. Kelsey, the Dean of the Chapel, to Darrell Walker, what did you call it, the orchestrator of, I can't remember, the facilitator of this experience today. And for a good number of friends that I haven't seen in a little while, I'm grateful to be back here. My name is Reverend Jasper Peters. I'm the pastor of Belong Church and also an alumni of Iliff. There was a time when I said I left here about 5 minutes ago, but 5 minutes, there have been many instances of that 5 minutes, and they've added up. So it's been nearly 3 years since I left here, but Iliff has not and will not leave my heart. I have to offer one more bit of thanks. Thanks to my 9-year-old son, Judah, for lending me his iPad, because mine isn't working, and so I'm grateful for that gift of technology. I remember what it was like to be a 9-year-old here. My mother is an alum of Iliff, and I remember being in these spaces, in these halls at that age, and I remember it was about that time that she began to speak to me in a very strange way. She would say, well, when you go to seminary, remember to do this or do that. And when you're 9, that's a very odd conversation to have, and yet my mother is a prophet. She was going to be here. Initially, the plan was that we would preach here together, and she was unable to be here, so I offer apologies on her behalf, but I'll begin with a story that involves her, because it wasn't when I was 9, but almost 10 years later that I first fell in love with the Bible, and I want to tell you a little bit about how that happened. Something happened to me. I had this experience when I was at a conference, and I realized that I didn't know the Bible in the way that I wanted to know it, and so I began to read it, and the conference ended, and so I left this hotel, and then from there I was flying to Atlanta, Georgia, where my mother lived at the time, but I didn't want to stop reading the Bible, so I borrowed it from my friend Gideon, and I kept reading, and I kept reading. And these aren't really helpful study Bibles that you find in hotel rooms, but I read and I read and I read, and I showed up in my mother's house, and she expected me to be excited and social, and instead I went to my room and I closed the door, and I read and I read, and I did the thing that you tell people not to do. I began in Genesis 1, and I just kept going and going and going, and finally she came into the room and said, what's happening? What is going on right now? And I explained, I want to know what's in here. I want to find out something about God, about community, about this tradition, about the history of it. And she took away my friend Gideon's Bible from me, and instead she grabbed one off of her shelf. And it was an NIV study Bible, and she opened it up to the front, and she inscribed something to me. She signed it over to me and said it was from her, and she said, "Preach the word in season and out." And I didn't know where those words had come from. And there's a lot of reading you have to do to get from Genesis 1 to 2 Timothy. There's a lot in the middle. I wish I could say I plowed straight through. When I got to Leviticus, it got deep and it got thick, and so I jumped ahead a little bit. I did some skipped stones through the Hebrew Bible, but then I got to Matthew, and I plowed through, and finally I got to these words from 2 Timothy, "Preach the word and be prepared in season and out of season." And I'm grateful for my mother for speaking that prophetic word into my life. So this morning, what I want to talk about a little bit is, what does it mean to be in a season? It was still cold enough out this morning that I made my son wear his coat, at least at the beginning in the morning when we left home. Technically, we're just a few weeks from spring, but I've lived in this state too long to believe that the weather has any respect for the date on the calendar. A season is not dictated by just one day. The weather on one day might not reflect the truth that we know. We recognize that the change in season is slow, but it is consistent changes around us that reveal to us the way that things might be changing. The author of 2 Timothy, he doesn't mean the season in terms of the weather. I should say they, because we don't really know, but I'm trying to be a good Iliffian, but also a faithful preacher, so please forgive me in my missteps. Whoever that author is, we don't know. They don't mean the seasons outside. They don't mean the weather that we experience. Rather, they're referring to the fact that there will be times of truth, and And there will be times when doing the right thing or the best thing or speaking the truth are not welcome in the public discourse or in the minds of those that we'd like to reach. This is the season in which we find ourselves. There's a sorrow in this season today. There's a poet that was born 200 years ago, but Dr. King would frequently quote him. My father introduced me to this quote. The piece is called The Present Crisis. You might have heard this before. The truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. We might say in the office, but that's a different sermon perhaps. But does that sound familiar, that the truth forever on the scaffold? Being out of season is more than just wearing shorts when it's snowy outside. It's more than being off-beat or off-brand. Being off-season, being out of season, means being fundamentally unwelcome in some way, shape, or form. Being out of season for me sometimes looks like being in a black body in a world that is dominated by white supremacy. In virtue of our identity, we are told that we must always be on the outside, that our lives will be lived on the margins. Being out of season is being unwelcomed in your very presence, knowing that your voice is unwelcome, being unsafe in your body, in your skin, knowing that your very existence is a threat. Some of us know what it means to be out of season, especially in the world today. Now, if it's uncomfortable to be out of season as a person, it's downright dangerous to be a prophet out of season. It is difficult to have a voice that rings with a dissonant tone, a voice that creates controversy and conflict when we speak out. To be a preacher, a teacher, a prophet out of season means that your work might be the very thing that undoes you. Let's be honest, they might kill you, and it wouldn't be the first time. If they don't kill you, there's the very real risk that your work you might never see your work come to fruition. I think about Harriet and Sojourner. And even though they lived to see freedom, they didn't truly see and experience or taste freedom. I think about Martin and Malcolm, gunned down before they got to see their work come to fruition. I think about Trayvon, whose life had barely begun before it was stolen from him. It is difficult to be a prophet out of season. You might remember the prophet Elijah. You might remember that he was a prophet that operated out of season. At one point in a particular persecution in his life, when he was running for his life, he cried out to God. He said, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." I've had a couple Sundays that feel like that. Do you know what I mean? Like by Sunday afternoon or evening, I'm not quite sure that I'm able to stand up to this particular task. But he goes on to say, he says to God, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." This prophet, out of season, out of favor, or so he believed. He cried out to God and said, "Your timing is all wrong. This isn't how it's supposed to be. This is too hard, and my voice isn't strong enough to make a difference." But little did Elijah know or understand that God had raised up more prophets than he knew, more teachers than he knew, more preachers than he knew, more voices to tell the truth in or out of season, that he was not alone in his well-doing. To be a prophet, a preacher, or a teacher is to be out of season most of the time. In recent years, I had resigned myself to be out of season. When I left Iliff and entered into my first pastoral appointment, it was about 4 weeks later that I broke down to a friend and I said, "I think that all the things that I wanted to do in the next year, I'll be lucky if I can get half of those done in the next 5. All of the things I thought I'd be able to do, all the change I thought I'd be able to create, I don't know if I'm in an environment that will foster the vision that God has given me. I don't know how to do this work. I am no better than my ancestors. God, this might be enough." In recent years, I had resigned myself to be out of season, to be a voice in the wilderness. I resigned myself that my children might get to see a day that is not so besieged by evil and wrongdoing, but I probably wouldn't get to see any day such as that. But then I remembered something. I remembered that a season is not dictated by any one day. That a season is not dictated by any one thing or one administration or one set of circumstances. A season, we recognize the change in season as slow and consistent changes in the environment around us. And so I want to submit something to you. Might we be invited in this moment, in this time, as difficult as it is, might we be invited in this moment to believe that our season is coming? I have to admit to you that I'm beginning, I dare say, I'm beginning to be hopeful. And I haven't forgotten what Dr. De La Torre said about being hopeful or being optimistic, but still, I find myself beginning to be a little bit hopeful, and perhaps I can invite you into that same space. Every morning I wake up and I read the news, and there's this pit in my stomach when I see all of the things that are wrong all over this world. And if that wasn't enough, a few weeks ago I had the opportunity to travel to the Holy Land with my bishop and some of the other folks who've been ordained in 2016 and 2017 in this area of the UMC. And I saw other people posting pictures from similar journeys, but their journeys were quite different. We've spent the first 3 days in Palestine. We spent the first 3 days sitting with people who have running water about once every 14 days. With people who are besieged by walls and threatened with machine guns and tear gas. Most of the weapons that are used against them, by the way, are manufactured and supplied right here in the United States of America. We sat there for 3 days with people whose lives externally, initially to me, appeared to be fundamentally broken. I recognized myself in a space, in a place that was far out of season, and yet when I encountered these people, I encountered a people of hope. I encountered people who believe that the situation today and even the situation of the days and weeks and years past do not have the ability to dictate the season that is to come. These are people that believe that their season is coming. So I began to be on the lookout. I began to look with a different eye, a different set of senses around me to see what might I perceive about the season that perhaps is coming. And can I be honest, this might be a little thing. But when I see a box office busted wide open with celebration of blackness, this melanin-rich display of who we might have been had we not been kidnapped, when I see any kind of celebration of blackness and freedom, when I see blackness being celebrated outside the month of February, when I begin to see these kinds of things, I began to believe that our season is coming. Now, the acoustics are different in this chapel, and perhaps I didn't hear you, but I want to say again that our season is coming. When Trayvon was murdered and his murderer walked free, it was devastating and it was heartbreaking, but we began to hear these voices, these dissonant voices, these voices that were inconvenient, and yet they proclaimed this inherent truth that there's an inherent worth in each and every life, and yes, that black lives matter. In that moment, I began to believe that our season is coming. When the secret of sexual assault that sits in plain sight, people unwilling to sit silently before perpetrators in positions of power, reclaiming their voices and autonomy in order to say, me too, I began to believe that perhaps our season is coming. When I hear these voices of young people that we expect to be heartbroken in the midst of tragedy, these voices crying out over and against the moneyed interests that want to silence them. When I hear these voices cry out, never again shall we face weapons of war turned against children in the schoolhouse. When I hear these voices, I begin to believe in the deepest part of my heart that our season is coming. For those of us, for those preachers and teachers and prophets among us, who are willing to be faithful through seasons that feel inclement at best, seasons of brutality and assault and brokenness, of marginalization and near obliteration. For those of us who are willing to be faithful through such times, I begin to believe that our season is coming. So my friends, my family, can we be faithful through the darkness? Believing that despite the sorrow, despite the pain and death that we perceive, that over and against all who might oppress us, that we are those preachers, those teachers, those prophets who have been faithful as we work out of season. I wonder if we dare to believe that our season is coming. Amen.